17-year-old slave sits in an Egyptian dungeon, falsely accused and completely forgotten. But in 3 days, he'll interpret dreams that will change the course of history. Today, we're diving deep into Genesis 40 through Seventh-day Adventist commentary and Ellen G. White's profound insights, exploring how God transforms our darkest moments into stepping stones and what Joseph's prison experience reveals about divine timing. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how suffering refines character and why being forgotten by people often means being remembered by God.
So let's start with the bigger picture here. What was Joseph's situation when we enter Genesis 40?
Joseph is in prison, but according to the page content, he had actually prospered even in his circumstances. The end of Genesis 39 shows he had great authority and responsibility in the prison operations, even as a prisoner. But here's what Ellen White reveals that's fascinating. This whole journey was actually refining his character.
Wait, refining his character? I thought Joseph was already the good guy in this story.
That's what makes Ellen White's insights so compelling. She writes that Joseph's father had actually done him wrong through partiality and indulgence. The page content says he was becoming self-sufficient and exacting, and that faults had been encouraged that now needed to be corrected.
So the favoritism that made his brothers jealous was actually creating problems in Joseph himself?
Exactly. Ellen White describes how in just one day's experience, being sold into slavery, Joseph learned what years might not otherwise have taught him. It transformed him from a petted child to a man who was thoughtful, courageous, and self-possessed.
That's incredible. So by the time we get to Genesis 40, Joseph has already been through this character transformation. Now what happens?
2 high-ranking officials arrive in prison, the butler and baker of the king of Egypt. According to the commentary, the butler oversaw Pharaoh's wine and the baker was in charge of Pharaoh's food. They had offended their lord and were imprisoned.
And these weren't just any servants, right? These were important positions?
Absolutely. The page content explains that royal courts in the ancient Near East depended on trusted officers who protected the king's table and person. The chief cupbearer handled access to Pharaoh, tasted for safety, and often became a counselor because of constant proximity.
So these guys had serious access to power. What were they suspected of?
Here's where it gets interesting. The commentary suggests there was probably a plot to murder Pharaoh, perhaps by poisoning, and these 2 were suspects. But then it says something profound. They were probably there on suspicion of murder, but they were really there because God wanted them to meet Joseph.
Whoa, so even a murder plot becomes part of God's plan? That's wild.
That's the theme running through all of this. Sandy Adams is quoted in the page content saying, "What we call hindrances, obstacles, disappointments are probably God's opportunities." Joseph's life is proof of Romans 8:28, all things working together for good.
And the captain of the guard puts Joseph in charge of these prisoners. That tells us something about Joseph's reputation, doesn't it?
Yes, and here's a crucial detail. The page content notes that this favorable treatment shows Potiphar didn't really believe his wife's accusations against Joseph. We know this because Potiphar himself was the captain of the guard.
So even though Joseph was imprisoned, his character was still shining through?
Exactly. And notice what the commentary says about how Joseph used his authority. Though he had a position of high authority in the prison, he didn't use it to make others serve him. He used his high position to serve others.
That's such a contrast to how power usually works. So then these officials have their dreams. What happens next?
This is where Joseph's character really shows. The page content says Joseph came to them in the morning, looked at them, and saw that they were sad. So he asked, "Why do you look so sad today?"
That seems like such a small thing, but I'm guessing it's significant.
The commentary calls it a window into the heart of Joseph. It says men who are consumed with anger and bitterness do not often take concern for the personal problems of others, as Joseph did here.
So his compassion reveals that he wasn't bitter about his own situation?
Right. The page content notes it would be easy for Joseph to think that because of all the wrong done against him, everything should center on his own feelings and hurts. Instead, he cared that these men looked sad.
And one commentary even says, in this, Joseph shows us Jesus. That's a pretty powerful connection.
It really is. So the officials explain they've had dreams, but there's no interpreter. And here comes one of the most important statements in the chapter. Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams."
That's such a humble response. He's not claiming any special ability for himself.
Exactly. The page content emphasizes that Joseph does not claim technique. He points to the Lord who rules time and unveils meaning. This is crucial because dreams held weight in Egyptian culture, with specialists keeping manuals of dream signs.
So Joseph is essentially saying the Egyptian dream experts have it wrong. True interpretation comes from God?
That's exactly right. The commentary states that Scripture insists true meaning comes from God, who knows the end from the beginning. It declares that wisdom belongs to the Lord who gives it to whom he wills.
So what were these dreams about?
The butler dreamed of a vine with 3 branches that budded, blossomed, and brought forth ripe grapes. He pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and gave it to Pharaoh. Joseph interpreted this as 3 days until his restoration to his position.
And the baker's dream?
The page content describes it as darkening to judgment. The commentary says one dream ripened to restoration, the other darkened to judgment. 3 days later, exactly as Joseph predicted, one was restored to office and one was executed.
So Joseph's interpretations were completely accurate. But there's a painful twist at the end, isn't there?
Yes. The page content says, the last sentence falls with a thud. The restored cupbearer did not remember Joseph, he forgot him. After Joseph specifically asked to be remembered and mentioned to Pharaoh.
That must have been devastating. Joseph helps this guy, saves his life essentially, and then gets forgotten.
But here's what's profound. The commentary notes that waiting continues under the Lord's quiet hand. God's presence with Joseph doesn't always open doors quickly, but it does supply the word needed in the moment, even as the servant waits.
So even being forgotten is part of God's timing?
That seems to be the message. Ellen White describes how Joseph gave himself fully to the Lord and prayed that the keeper of Israel would be with him in his exile. His soul thrilled with the resolve to prove himself true to God under all circumstances.
There's something about that phrase, under all circumstances, that really hits me. Even when people forget you, even when good deeds go unrewarded.
And notice the progression in Joseph's character. Ellen White writes that he would serve the Lord with undivided heart, meet trials with fortitude, and perform every duty with fidelity. This prison experience was shaping him for something greater.
You know what strikes me about this whole story? Joseph could have become bitter when the butler forgot him. Instead, he stayed faithful.
That's the key insight. The page content describes Joseph's life with this quote, "In duty he was loyal, in temptation he was strong, and in prison he was faithful." Each trial was preparing him for the next level of responsibility.
And there's that pattern again, from pit to Potiphar's house to prison to palace. Each seeming setback was actually a setup.
Exactly. The page content quotes that Joseph's journey gets splattered with what appears to be disaster after disaster, but God's providence and Joseph's piety combine to turn each tragedy into a stepping stone.
So what can we learn from Joseph's response to being forgotten? Because that's something a lot of people can relate to.
The Adventist Youth Ministries material asks a powerful question. Have you turned to godly people, as they turned to Joseph, to help you find the meaning God has put in the dreams for you? Sometimes we're called to be the Joseph for others, even when we're forgotten.
That's beautiful. So even in our own difficult seasons, we can still be instruments of God's revelation to others.
And here's what I find remarkable. The page content notes that Joseph's act of attentive compassion became the doorway to what God planned to reveal. His kindness opened the door for God to work.
So when we step back from all this, what's the bigger message about how God works in our lives?
The page content emphasizes that God allows us to be tested, mistreated, and forgotten to refine and develop us into the people needed for such a time as this in history. We don't really know who we are until we're tested.
And Joseph's story shows that character is built in the hidden places, in prison cells where nobody sees except God.
That's exactly right. Ellen White writes that one day's experience had been the turning point in Joseph's life. Its terrible calamity transformed him from a petted child to a man, thoughtful, courageous, and self-possessed.
Here's what really strikes me. Joseph never complained about being falsely accused, even after he was elevated to the second most powerful position in Egypt. The page content asks why he never said anything about it.
That's such a profound question. I think it shows that Joseph understood his suffering had a purpose. He wasn't focused on vindication because he was focused on God's plan unfolding.
And that brings us back to that central truth. Interpretations belong to God. Not just dream interpretations, but life interpretations too.
Beautiful connection. The page content emphasizes that we should seek God's guidance in all aspects of our lives, surrendering our need for control and understanding to receive profound insights and spiritual guidance.
So the next time we feel forgotten, overlooked, or like our good deeds have gone unnoticed, we can remember Joseph in that prison cell.
Exactly. And remember that the phrase, "the OOA was with Joseph," appears 4 times in this section. Even when people forget us, God never does. Even when circumstances look hopeless, God is working.
You know what's amazing? That 17-year-old slave we started with, he's about to become the second most powerful person in Egypt. But first, he had to learn to serve faithfully in a prison cell.
And that's the pattern for all of us. God uses our forgotten moments, our prison experiences, our times of waiting to prepare us for the purposes He has in mind. The key is staying faithful in the process.
Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. Remember, the next time you feel forgotten or overlooked, you might just be in your Genesis 40 moment, where God is preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. Sometimes being forgotten by people means being remembered by God.